Chapter 16. The Old Adam. This was the younger one's favorite place on the farm. Here, to this fence corner by the run, they came any time they could sneak off from their stints. When it was hot, they made a shelter of leaves overhead from rail to rail. When it was cool and sunny, they took down the branches, and the close-set rails shut out the wind. In March, the sun melted the snow here first and dried off the ground to sit on. In April, they played hens and roosters, yoking their wild white and blue violets to see which would get its head pulled off. By summer, the deep fence corner made a play-party house, and by fall the wind raked the fallen leaves thick as a bed in here, where the sun warmed them. The best of it was they were off by themselves. No grown folks came here to spy on them. This place belonged to them. Lying here of a summer evening, with the stars falling and the woods hissing and cracking over yonder, you could believe any story you listened to. In the fall, when you would nigh on to freeze in the woods, you could lie here in the sun and bake like a potato in the fireplace. Truth to tell, they weren't lying down now. They were sitting up, swapping a secret. Not the littlest ones. Gordon, Kinsey, and Huldah had chased them off. Libby, Sooth, and Deesia had to sit off like orphans in another rail corner, while these older ones put their heads together. Miss Idy told me Huldah was saying she was sitting on her well curb. She called me in. Amy was with me, but she didn't let her come in. Miss Idy said it was shameful the way me and Libby and Sooth and Deesia had to go to Mistress Bartram to school. What did she say that for? Gordon demanded. She said on account of our ma'am, but she told me I darsn't tell her. What did the schoolmistress do to ma'am? She said she couldn't tell me, but Huldah's green eyes glittered. Can we come over now? Libby complained, from the distant rail corner, where the three sat resentfully watching. You stay right over Kinsey called back sharply. Why didn't she tell ma'am her own self? Gordon wanted to know. She wouldn't dare tell ma'am what to do. She could tell Aunt Jen for her. No, she couldn't. That would be as bad as telling ma'am. She told you, but she told me not to tell. Tell what? Gordon broke out. She didn't tell you nothing you could tell. She didn't have to. Don't you know what she was driving at? Huldah was only 10, but sly as a black fisher fox. Now she leaned forward and whispered in Gordon's ear. She just made that up for trouble, Gordon said angrily. She's always mixing in other people's business. Can we come over now? Sooth whined. No, you ain't old enough to listen to this, Kinsey told them. Libby kicked at him, although 5 or 6 poles away. I know as much as Huldah. You don't either. Huldah disdained her. Miss Idy wouldn't even talk to you. Now I heard enough about Idy Toll, Gordon declared. I'm a-goin' in to find out about this my own self. Don't you dare tell her I told you. Oh, I wouldn't say mush to that old gooseberry. Then how will you find out? You'd like to know, wouldn't you? Gordon deviled her. Well, if Pap had anything to do with it, we'll find out, won't we, Ken? We will if we want to, Kinsey said. I bet I know, Huldah cried. You reckon you know everything, Gordon jeered at her. Come on, Ken, where's Pap at? Kinsey stood up. You can come over now, he called magnanimously to the younger ones. We're a-goin' in the house. But the littlest ones weren't satisfied with that fence corner now. They smelled something was up and wanted part in it. What you taggin' after us for? Kinsey scowled, turning around at them. We can come if we want to, Libby told him. You can't tell us what to do, little Deesia piped up, grave as a gravestone. You're not our father and mother. I can take a switch on ya, Kinsey growled, though he didn't, for under his rust spots he had a heart tender as white meat. Their ma'am wasn't in the kitchen. She had company in the new room they had built this year. It wasn't tight against the house, but had a space between for the rain to run down from both roofs. A covered entry led from one room to the other, with 2 doors between. This was their best room. It had an off-the-floor bed in one corner, and their Pap's desk and cupboard in the other. The young ones called the old room the kitchen, and the new room Pap's room, for he slept and did his lawyer work in it. Now their ma'am still slept on her pallet in the kitchen with Deesia, Sooth, and Libby lay in the other corner. Huldah and Kinsey slept in one bed in the loft, and Gordon and Resolve in the other. Soon as the new loft was laid, the 3 boys would sleep over there, and the girls would go up in the old loft with Huldah. Oh, the boys wouldn't mind the change. They'd be glad to get rid of the youngest ones, and Kinsey of sleeping with a girl, if it was his sister. Resolve stayed over in the new room half the time now, reading law with his pappy. Gordon and Kinsey said he just did it to get out of work in the field. They claimed they even had to chop his firewood. That was the main thing they had against the new room. They had 2 fireplaces to keep in wood now, where they had only one before. Just the same, it was a very fine room, with hickory chairs, and a red cherry cupboard for books, and household stuff. Only on Sundays did Sayward take her company in it, unless great folks like Major Tate or Colonel Sutton and his wife came. During the week, ever since Gordon could remember, plenty company stopped at his mam's and Pap's house. Today they found Aunt Jenny, the Covenhovens, Will Beagle, and Ezra Griswold, the miller, visiting in the new room. What do you all want in here? Their mother put to them, as the 6 trooped in, Indian file, the biggest first, and the littlest on behind. Nothing much, Gordon said to put her off. I do, Huldah put in, for she thought quicker. I want to see Aunt Jen. Me too, Libby and Sooth called out, before their ma'am should say they hadn't room for all, and on such a nice day they could play outside. Aunt Jenny looked pleased. She was only a wisp of a woman, thin as a girl, and fonder than a grandma of her nieces and nephews. You could see her watch admiringly at little Deesia, going up to each visitor big as a grown-up. Howdy-do, she'd say, sober and matter-of-fact as she could be. Then she'd go to the next. Oh, she was the oldest little body you ever saw. For a good while the younger ones sat around watching the older ones to see what was up. All they could tell was that Guerdon, Kinsey, and Huldah kept their eyes on their pappy. Guerdon looked half bamboozled, and felt that way too. He couldn't believe this about his pappy. His father looked noble as always, in his fine black broadcloth coat, with black velvet lapels, sitting in one of the best chairs with his legs straight out in front of him, and his great chin down on his breast. He wasn't sleeping or tired. That was just the grand way he sat. He had filled out of late, and got powerful looking. Guerdon wouldn't want to stand a hitch with him if he could help it. The cabin air and grown-up talk made Guerdon gapy. He didn't even know he was nodding till Kinsey nudged him. Their pappy had stood up. "Well, I regret I must leave this pleasant gathering," he said in a deep voice. "But I promised to see Squire Chew and one or two others." Guerdon, Kinsey, and Huldah exchanged special looks. When their pappy put on his high hat, Guerdon and Kinsey edged forwards on their bench, and when he had gone, they stood up. "Now where do you reckon you have to go to?" Aunt Jenny asked for something pleasant to say. "Oh, we ain't goin' no place much," Guerdon lied to her. "Then you can stay and visit with me a little now that your pap's gone. I'll come over and talk to you some other time, Aunt Jen," Guerdon said. "You can wait 5 minutes." "No, I just minded something I got to do." "Sit down and talk to your Aunt Jenny," his mother ordered him. Guerdon looked desperate. "I can't, I got to go out," he cried, and went for the door, Kinsey after him. "You must go out too, Kinsey," his mother called sarcastically. Kinsey bobbed his head as he bolted. The last thing Guerdon heard was his Aunt Jenny's voice saying, "Now what devilment are they up to?" When they got outside, they could see their father over near the church. They watched his figure move straight and firm up the trace. "He's a-goin' to Squire Chew's, like he said," Kinsey muttered righteously. "Maybe he is, maybe he ain't," Guerdon said. "I never heard him tell a lie." "Not right out, but a lawyer can tell the truth and still not mean what you reckon he says. Like I said, I had to go out. I didn't lie, because I didn't say what I had to go out for." The two boys stood by the house unmoving, eyes on their father. When his dark figure was swallowed up in the forest, they stole over to the trace. They just saw his high hat and long black stately coat move around the bend. And that's the way they followed him, not like hounds a-rushing and bang, so the game knew they were after him, but like two painters trailing a deer, and never letting on they were behind. One time Noah Andrews gave them a funny look after passing their pap just on ahead. Guerdon made as though he was in no hurry then, breaking off sassafras to chew, although anybody knew it was tough in the fall. "He's headin' straight for Squire Chew's, like I said." "You said," Kinsey came back. You said he only said he was goin' ar." "I said no such thing. I only said he might. I said he was goin' ar." Oh, they both claimed now they knew he was going to Squire Chew's. They fought about it all the way to the next bend, where they jumped back in a hurry. They had seen their father standing about 100 poles up on the trace. He was throwing a slow, majestic look around him. Now they peeked through the brush and saw him turn east in the woods. "I told you he wa'n't a-goin' to the squire's," Gordon said. Nobody lived up that path. They both were aware. It was just an old Indian path that ran off to the hills. They waited a while, then went cautiously after, turning in where their father had turned, and following carefully until they came to a fork. Now they didn't know which way to take, but Gordon thought he smelled tobacco smoke on the left fork, and none on the right. The left was the way they went. One time you could smell tobacco, and one time you couldn't. After a while it grew stronger. It smelled like their pappy's pipe. "Oh, I know whar this goes," Kinsey said. "Hush up," Gordon told him. "He mought be hangin' around here anywheres." Gordon knew where that path went too. When they stopped to listen, they could hear falling water somewhere ahead. It came from the hollow sum called the dell. Those who had seen it reckoned it a mighty pleasing place, with the water coming down over the red rock ledges, but few ever came in here, save in the summer time. It had but one path in and out, and Gordon reckoned they better get off that path. They might meet their pappy coming out, and then they'd be grilled over the fire. Oh, if they were careful before, they were double careful now. They hadn't dare make any noise going through the brush. The leaves were the worst, for the early ones, like the gum and quaking ash, were down. Once they got up near the edge of the dell, they went on their hands and knees, and the last couple yards on their bellies. Gordon was on ahead. He wriggled his head through a huckleberry bush, where he could look down in the hollow. It was a seemly sight from up here, with the leafy banks on either side, and the water running down the red ledges in the sun. At one place the hollow widened in a ring with high brush all around. There he could see his pappy walking in a patch of sunlight, smoking his pipe. "You stay back," he warned Kinsey. "He mought see you." "What's he doin'?" Kinsey wanted to know. "He ain't doin' nothin', just trampin' up and down." "That all?" Kinsey said, disappointed. "Then what did he come in here for?" Oh, his pappy hadn't come in here for nothing. Gordon knew. If they lay long enough, they'd find out, if it didn't get dark on them first. He heard a stick crack under Kinsey, wriggling up to see for himself. Gordon kicked at him. "Stay on back, somebody's a-comin'." Away down yonder in the woods, he could make out two women's figures. Just for a shake, then the leaves shut them out again. They were on the path to the dell. It had a place after a while when he could see them again, and now one kept standing there, while the other came on alone. Oh, he knew that one who stayed down there. He could tell by her red plaid dress. That was Mary McWhirter, where the teacher boarded. She and the teacher were thick as thieves, but what was she staying down there by herself for? "Who is it?" Kinsey kept a whispering from in back. "It's the schoolmistress," Gordon said. "She's comin' up the holler." What's she after? Kinsey wanted to know. Gordon's eyes never left off watching the path for places where the schoolmistress would come out. All the time she was getting closer. Now her buck-brown coat was hurrying into the dell. "She knows our pappies are," he said. That's about all he would say right off, though Kinsey kept a pokin' at him with a long stick. He wanted to know what was going on now. Could Gordon see good? What was their pappy doing? What was the schoolmistress doing? Oh, Gordon never missed a lick of what went on. His eyes appearing out of that huckleberry bush were black and beady as a coon's watching two frogs in the old beaver gats. He couldn't see all he'd like to, for the brush hid some of it, but he could see enough. So that's why she had Mary McWhirter come along with her. It looked like they were only out for a walk this fine Sabbath afternoon. Oh, she was smart enough. She kept Mary McWhirter so far off she couldn't see who the schoolmistress was a-meeting. Now, after a good long time, the schoolmistress went down the path first. After she and Mary were safe off, Gordon saw his pappy go down. He waited till all was still as the grave, save for the water running down over the red rock ledges. Then he and Kinsey came out and slid down the long steep bank. Gordon went over the hollow with a stick, graphically pointing out to his brother the epic places, like his pappy used to point out with a ruler what had gone on in various parts of the world, drawn in white clay on the logs and daubing of the schoolhouse wall. It was sundown when they got back to the house. Their pappy wasn't home yet. Likely he had gone to Squire Chew's, and those other places, he said, for their pappy never told what wasn't so. But Huldah was home a-watching for them. She ran outside when she heard them coming. Just the way they swaggered over the run showed how much they could tell if they wanted to. But they wouldn't tell her anything. It wasn't for a girl to hear. They said they would tell only Resolve. He was the one ought to know. "What ails ya up are, whisperin' all night like thieves?" their mother called long after they went to the loft to bed. "Can't we talk a little if we want to?" Gordon complained. "It's late. Go on to sleep," Sayward told them. Kinsey crawled reluctantly over to his bed with Huldah, but he still would tell her nothing. "Oh, you don't need to think you're the only ones that know," she flared. "I knew it all the time." In the other bed, Gordon was giving a last word to Resolve. "You're the one to tell Ma'am. You're her favorite. It ain't right for Libby and Sooth and Deesia to go to that woman for school. Idie Toll said so." Resolve lay quiet, hardly sang a word. Long after the others had lost the day in sleep, he lay awake, remembering. He might be closest to his ma'am, but he looked up to his father more than any person in the world. His eyes kept staring at the rain stains on the underside of the clapboards. They made strange shapes, every one different, and he knew them all. That over Huldah was the Chinaman. Over himself was the big thumb of Florida, with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. All around the roof you could make out rain stains that looked like something. One a doe's head, one a camel, and one a volcano with smoke coming out. Over the window it looked like a map of the English lakes, although Libby claimed it was the leaves of a wake robin. The fire from downstairs shone up through the loft hole and played on everything softly. Try as he might tonight, Resolve couldn't find the land of Nod. He turned on one side, then the other. The corn husks felt mighty thin and hard. Seemed like he could feel every knot in the loft boards through them. He still couldn't get this through his head. If Gordon hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't believe it. Some words of a poem he heard kept going through his mind. He had been along when his father was lawyer for Alec Blue, and defended him in front of the squire. Miss Caldwell had Alec arrested. He came when my man was off and tried to fool around me, she claimed. Well, what did he do? Squire Chew had asked. He got hold of me and wanted me to fool with him and make free with him, Miss Caldwell kept saying. I had to screech for help before he made off. Resolve had felt shame that his pappy had taken Alec's side in that case. Resolve said as much on the trace on the way home. His pappy had spoken long in Alec Blue's defense, but he said no word in his own now. He just recited a strange poem, sang it by heart, as they tramped together through the woods. Resolve wished he could recollect that poem tonight. Maybe he would feel better and go to sleep if he knew it. He got out of bed and down the ladder in his bedgown. When he reached the door that led to his father's room, his mam spoke from her bed. "Where you goin'?" He might have known she wouldn't go to sleep till his pappy came in. Not that he would come in on this side tonight, but she could hear him on the other side. "I have to look something up in a book," he said. At this time of night, she came back. But she didn't deny him or ask him what. To be a lawyer like his pappy, he'd have to pack a world of knowledge in his young head. It was chilly crossing the dog trot, or what some called the wind sweep, in a bedgown and bare feet. But his pappy's room was snug and warm with a good fire going, though no one was there. His mam must have seen to the fire after they went to bed. Resolve warmed his feet a while on the gray moose rug, looking at his father's and mother's fine off-the-floor cherry bed. It was strange his mam never slept in it like other wives did with their men, though she let on to nobody outside that she didn't. He knew just where in the cupboard that poem was. He had come on it before. It was in a fine leather book, with the name of its author in worn gold letters. No book of his father's was harder used. He held it by the fire and paged through till he came to the poem he wanted. It had no name, he saw now, so that was why he couldn't remember it. All it had was a number, 129. He read it slowly so he could get every word, the red light flickering on the page. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust, is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Oh, this wasn't himself reading it, but his father. From the first line he could hear his pappy's voice, gravely ringing through the woods, as it had that day they tramped together along the trace after Alec Blue's hearing. Enjoyed no sooner than despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated, as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Even his father's feelings came out in his ear. how he had chewed the phrase, despised straight, and with what contempt he had spat out the lines, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated, as a swallowed bait, mad in pursuit, and in possession so, had having and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. Twice he read the sonnet through, never before had he understood the poet's language like tonight, after Gordon had talked to him. So that's why they called Shakespeare the master. Away back in England, when America had hardly been more than settled, he wrote this, and yet it was as true here today as then. Didn't resolve no. Quickly when he heard a boot on the ground outside, his finger turned the leaves of the book to some other place. The door opened, and his father came in. "You're up late," he said sternly, putting his hat away, hanging up his best coat and putting on an older one, in case he sat too close to the fire. He pulled up his chair to the hearth, glancing with dignity to see what the boy in his bedgown was reading, as Resolve knew he would. Then he opened a book of his own by the fire. After a minute, Resolve looked up. It was a book with slanted Greek letters on the cover that his father had in his hand. How could his father sit there, he asked himself, so noble and fine, like always, his dignified legs firmly crossed, his face calm with a kind of majesty and justice. After a little, the boy closed his own book and put it away. Then he went across the dog trot and up to his bed. No, he would say nothing to his mam, nor would he let anybody else either. Chapter 17. Red Bird. It definitely had more trees down now. Sayward noticed it every time she stepped out of the house. She could stand on the cabin steps and look clear past the church, past the store and ferry house, and see the sun shining on the river. This was the farthest you could see from the cabin, since it was raised. Your eye could go back to the spring, too, over to the school and down close to the old beaver gats. Oh, you needn't climb the top of a tree to see Bars Hill or Panther Hill any more. Here at the Moonshine Church, they were coming out of the woods. It was slow but sure as Christian heaven. Strange how the land lay after it was cleared to the sun. So long as the forest stood, you didn't take much notice, save for the hills and hollows. Take that 4-acre field she would put in flax this year. It looked plumb level when it was in woods. Not till it was cleared and plowed did the dips and twists, the low and high places come out, and a slope so strong that the rain washed it. She was telling Porteous only last night it was like Worth's face when she was a girl. Not till he wanted to go to the settlement would he get her to put razor to his long black stubble. Then all were surprised to see what their pappy's face really looked like. She and Porteous, and later she and Resolve, had cleared their ground. George Roebuck had cut down the trees around his new post, and Sam Slopper for his ferry house, and the lane that ran betwixt his place and Roebuck's. She could hear Slopper's ferry bell ringing now on the quiet Sabbath air. He had set it up on a post outside the ferry house and stretched a line of hemp across the river. If the ferry was on this side and you were on the other, you could give that bell a yank, and he'd come over. It gave out a mighty long, sweet sound through the woods. Most everybody stopped their work to listen when they heard it, but the Shawanese liked it best. They went plumb crazy over that bell. They made themselves such a nuisance, standing around the ferry house, ringing it all day. Sam chased them off from this side. Then they got to pulling the rope from the other side. When Sam came out to take his boat across, thinking he had a passenger waiting, they would dive in the bushes. When he went back in the house, they'd go at it again. They just liked to hear that bell ring. Sayward walked around the side of her house. It wouldn't be long now till the Covenhovens' fields and hers joined up. She could look out then and see smoke rising from Jenny's fire. Jenny was a fixture at the Covenhovens by this time. Colonel Suttum had offered her wages if she'd come up to his great log house with a long, sloping roof that came out in a kind of forebay like a barn. Under that forebay they had an outside room with benches they called a porch. He wanted her to help with the housework, but Will Beagle didn't wish her to take it. Besides, Jenny was like one of the family at Big John's. She had it easy too, for neither she nor the Covenhovens had chick nor child to their name. And yet Sayward was telling Miss Covenhoven only last week. Here she was just a short piece from her sister, and hardly ever did they see each other last winter save at meeting. She would be glad when the last strip of woods was down between. Then she could look out and see Jenny fetch in wood, or hang up the wash, or go to the outhouse. Yes, the country around here was taming up a little with the woods partly cut down. It didn't seem like the Ohio wilderness any more on a soft day like today. You could see and smell spring in the air. The whole countryside hung in a faint blue March mist. Oh, you knew spring wasn't here to stay. That's what made it so mortal sweet. In the woods was still winter, but here in the open fields it was different. The bosom of the old earth warmed to the milky sun, like a babe to its mam who had been off a good while. The ground thawed. Every place had water running and tinkling. They'd had such good licks of rain lately, and last winter's deep snows had left plenty moisture deep in the guts of the old earth. It would likely run out all summer in the springs and small branches. Where she had sowed grass seed on the last melting snow, the ground was already faintly green with tiny shoots, and Libby claimed she had seen blue stem mint along the run where it liked to keep its feet wet, along with calmus root. Little birds were here flushing out of the winter wheat and feeding along the cleared ground. On the other side somewheres came the tank-a-lank-lank of stars and bossies and spots bells. Those cows knew just where to crop along the edge of the woods, where the sun and warmth of the open fields had swelled up the leaf buds with sap and life. Now who was that coming up the run with her younger ones? It looked like Billy Harbison with something in his hand. When she got closer she saw it was a bird in a cage that he made his own self out of basket willow. "Why, Billy," she said, pleased, "I haven't seen you in a coon's age. How's Mary and Salome?" "Oh, middlin' fair," he told her. "They never come down any more," Sayward complained. "I reckon they just don't get around to it," he said, dodging her eyes. Sayward didn't need ask more. She knew why they didn't come like they used to. The last years, Billy looked like a bush nipple in his old-style buckskin hunting frock, with half the tassels torn off. His breeches had a leather seat and knees, but the homespun parts were nigh onto whipped to pieces by the brush. His cap was fur, even in the summer-time. Oh, she knew good enough, hadn't her own pappy been a hunter like Billy, when this was still all woods and game. He had been good as anybody else, and better than most, for he knew just where to get meat for his table, and skins that were good as gold at the post. Yes, those days, Worth Luckett and Billy Harbison, with their rifles and hounds, counted for something around here. But the country had changed, and passed Billy by. He'd lost his first place to Zephon Brown, and he never raised much on his second place up the river. He wouldn't hire out with the axe if he could help it. His work was following the woods. No one was better at it than he, but that's all he could do. Now the times had left him behind, for he couldn't fit himself to the new. He kept on hunting what game he could find, selling what pelts he could skin. Mostly they were small and no account. He helped out at butcherings and tramped far for sang. It hadn't much left to dig out, and he filled in with all the dried, slippery elm bark the chemist shop at Maytown could buy. Now and then he trapped some small beast or bird alive, and sold it as a pet. But gaby birds were getting scarce. Their fine green and gold feathers had doomed them. It was a slim living he made, and small comforts they had in their cabin up the river. Mary and Salome hadn't much to trick themselves out in, and that's why they didn't come around any more. Now that Sayward and Porteous were getting up in the world with farm and stock, a 2-pen cabin, and Porteous's lawyer business. "What you got, our Billy?" Sayward asked him. "Corn cracker," Billy said. He held up the cage. Behind the wicker bars the prisoner sat, with dejected red feathers. Billy shook the cage and whistled at the bird, but it never stirred. "He'll whistle once he's broke in," he promised. "I heard some around of late," Sayward told, "but I didn't think they were that plenty. How'd you get him?" "Oh, you got to know how," Billy grinned. His teeth were mossy brown as gray moose. He wouldn't tell. That was just like her pappy. Worth wouldn't tell his trapping secrets to his own young ones, for fear they'd give them away. "Can I have the red bird, ma'am?" Sooth begged. "It's for Miss Covenhoven," Billy explained. "She said she'd give me a shillin' for the cage, and maybe more for the bird." In the old days, Sayward thought, Billy would have given such for nothing. Sooth began to sniffle. "You can see it over at Aunt Jenny's," Sayward said. "I could fetch ye a fox kit," Billy offered. "I got one at the cabin, but maybe your mam don't want one." He looked slyly at Sayward. "You know that tame fox I sold the preacher down at Maytown? He got loose in the lot of the lady next door. She had sewn thread on the grass to bleach, and he rolled on it and tangled it. She claimed he spoiled it, dirtied it all up. You know how a fox does." "I want a red bird in a willer cage," Sooth wailed. "Well, I'll get you one," Billy promised. "I can't tell you when, but they're a-comin' in. I seed a bee bird last summer. It's no bigger'n a snake doctor. Feeds and hums like a honey bee. Quail partridges comin' in too, red-breast robins and bluebirds." "Land snakes," Sayward said, pleased. "Where are they all comin' from?" "It's the fields that fetch them. Possums here now, and slick-tailed mice, crows and blackbirds. The game's moved out, and they're a-movin' in. I reckon the woods is done for. It's farmin' country through here now." He said it sadly, his eyes far off, as if he was thinking of something long ago. "Come in the house, Billy. I'll get a piece for you. I got something you like," Sayward said. "No thanky, Sayrd. I want to get my money out of this corn cracker before he dies on me." She watched him as he went, carrying the freshly barked willow cage. It made her feel as if she were looking after her father. That's how he'd still dress if he were back in brush-whipped buckskins. That's about what he'd be doing, totting around some trapped bird or small beast to trade. And that's the pitiful way he'd walk. She felt glad he wasn't here. The country was changing fast. Why, she could mind when folks came from all over to see Hugh McFall's field without stumps. It was a 9 days' wonder then. Now she had a field like that herself. She was putting it back to corn this spring. It wouldn't be long now, she told herself, till the stumps in most of her fields would be gone, burned through, yanked up, and dug out. She hated, in a way, to see them go, for she knew every last one as good as she did her sheep and geese. The fat stumps and the leaner ones, those that leaned this way and those that leaned that. Some cut high, some low, some barked, and most of them blackened by fire. They were all she had left to remind her of the world of butts she had cut and niggered, mostly with her own hands, to free her black ground. Yes, times here in the Ohio wilderness were changing. When you went on Barr's Hill today, you could see the whole land circling around you, studded with farms. Why, this was settlement country now. Only yesterday an old woman from up Crazy Creek stopped at the cabin with her grandchild. She said the young one just moped in the woods at Crazy Creek. She didn't even want to tramp along to Moonshine Church to trade, not till she had passed through most of the woods and begun to smell the sweetness of chimney smoke, and know it had cabins with humans living close by, did she perk up. She couldn't get over all the worn paths that told how many young ones were living around here. And when she saw cleared field after field with rail fences, she started to talk with chatter. It was the farms here that done it, her grandmam said. The cleared land, the houses and cabins, the store and ferry house that opened her mind to life, like cutting down the trees opened the ground to light. It made a different young body out of her. Tonight, when Sayward came out after supper to help resolve milk, the sun was down behind the woods, and clear shadows lay over the fields. Half wild, half sweet it was. She took the cows out her own self to the black, stumpy pasture with its velvet sod cropped close to the ground. That pasture flowed right into the timber till the woods stood all around it. The bells on her cows sounded lazy on the evening air. A soft pink cloud floated over the trees like summer. The air moving down the run was cold and fresh as spring water. When she went back she could see her sheep together in a clump, facing the old straw stack. They liked to stand with their front feet higher than their hind ones, their heads highest of all. It was like a picture. They never moved, waiting for her to let them in the shed for the night. Yes, Billy was right, she told herself. This was getting to be farming country. If she didn't know it before, she did now, that the red birds had come. That was a sure sign. The times of the deep woods were passing. Farming times were coming around. It would be better times, too, if she knew anything. What was that catch Jenny used to sing when she was a slip of a girl? Haycocks in the meter, cherries in the dish, red bird fly up, give me my wish. Chapter 18, Cherry Oak. Now wasn't that a surprise, Sayward thought, the news that Jake Tench would marry the schoolmistress. Tomorrow morning it was to be up at Squire Chew's. Why, Jake was nigh onto old enough to be her pappy. He didn't own an acre of land to his name. All he worked at was to fetch goods for George Roebuck up the river and take down skins, grain, maple sugar, sang, perilla, and feathers. Whatever the posts here and Tateville took over the counter in trade. The only good things she ever knew he could do were steer a keel boat over rifles and help pull it back upstream. He wasn't Mistress Bartram's kind. Sayward always took it for granted nobody less than gentry would do for her. But when a babe is on the way, a bride can't be a chooser. The truth was Sayward felt surprise that Jake would ever marry her, for he was independent as all get out. Oh, he was wild enough, and would stop for neither dominie nor devil. Just the same, he must be beholden to the real father to give the lady a married name, and her unborn babe a father, for Sayward didn't believe the child his. Whose it was nobody made out to know. When she asked, not a soul could tell her. Just a woods colt was all they would say. Oh, this, Sayward reckoned, would be a sad enough wedding. She felt real sorry for the lady. She was such a pretty thing, with hair yaller and fine as chiny silk, and clothes neat as waxworks. Any other schoolmistress would have the best folks to her wedding, but none would come to this, Sayward guessed, unless she went her own self. Nobody but the close families would be bid to such makeshift doings, and neither bride nor bridesman had close kin in Ohio. That's why she spoke to Jake like she did when she passed him on the trace, for Jake was the oldest friend she had in the country. He had come to her wedding. Fact is, if it hadn't been for Jake, she would have no Porteous or family, either one. I'd come to your wedding if I was bid, Jake, she said. She never heard Jake laugh harder. He threw back his head, but it hadn't a good sound. Come on then, he told her. I bid you saird. But when she told Porteous, she felt the cabin air blow cold. She looked up and found him stern. I don't wish you to go there, he told her. Well, I guess I can if I want, she said mildly. I know Jake longer'n I do you. That's all she said. Not a word that it wasn't for Jake, but for his bride, that she was going. Already, when she came up the Chews lane, she had a kind of gloomy feeling. The squire's place lay back from the trace in the woods. It had a fine 2-story log house and a good-sized barn, but folks said it had no stock in it. She never saw a barn stand so far from the house. Oh, the place was laid out on grand lines, but hardly a well-cleared field to the squire's name. You had to stumble through brush and stumps to go from house to barn. Jake and Mistress Bartram were already inside, and Mary McWhirter with them. But if Sayward reckoned they would be glad to see her, she knew better now. Even Jake, at his own wedding, acted uneasy toward her. And Mary and the schoolmistress talked together in low voices, with their faces turned away. All the while Squire Chew and his wife stood like two black crows. Sayward never let it disturb her. She greeted them all hearty, then stood calm and peaceful as if all were right and proper here, as two missionaries marrying in a meeting house. After a while, as the lawful words came out in the raftered room, she felt something yield in those around her, so that the hardness slackened some, and she felt she had been of some use. But oh, she told herself, when she left, it had been a pitiful wedding, with Jake's hair wild and coarse as a bear's, and his lady pale like she just got out of a sick bed to marry her own coachman. Sayward never felt sorrier at a wedding. She couldn't put that girl's frightened tallow face out of her mind. She was glad to be off on the trace for home. When she got by the Covenhovens, Jenny was waiting for her at the start of the lane. Where you been? Jenny came right out like she was her sister, and had full right to know. Just up to the squire's, Sayward told her. You didn't go to that weddin'. What if I did? Sayward wanted to know. Jenny just set her lips and gazed at her. I heard it, but I wouldn't believe it. I'll get mad in a minute, Sayward told her patiently. Why couldn't I go if I wanted? Jenny opened her mouth so you could see her missing tooth. Then she closed it again. Well, I won't be the one to tell you and have you hold it against me. Sayward set her face. No, I had enough fooling from everybody about this thing. I won't stir from this spot till you come right out with it, she said, and anybody could tell she meant business. When she got back to the farm, Gordon and Kenzie were grubbing sprouts in the new ground, while the younger ones stood around waiting for her to show up. It was long past noon. She set to work right off getting their dinner. After a while she could feel her 4 girls watching her. Your headache, ma'am? Libby asked when she was nearly ready. No, Sayward shook it. You feel sick in any place? "No, I'm fine," Sayward said. "You don't look good." "Something's the matter with your eyes," Sayward told them. But when Kinsey came in, he asked too if she felt poorly. "Why, no, I'm good as I ever was." "Call your pap. Dinner's ready," she told them. But Kinsey said he wasn't there. He had gone to Tateville on business, and taken Resolve along. Something went through Sayward then. She didn't know she could feel so cheated. She might have known Porteous would go somewheres before she came back from the squire's. Well, perhaps it was better that way. This was the quietest meal she ever remembered, with the young ones at the table. Nobody whined or fought or complained. "Why don't you sit down and eat, ma'am?" Gordon plagued her. "I ain't a-hungry," she said. "You got to eat," Kinsey put in. "I know why she won't eat," Huldah told Kinsey. Sayward turned her weary eyes on her oldest girl. Never before had she noticed how Huldah fetched her sister Asha to mind. Oh, Asha had been heavy-set, while Huldah was slim as a maple whip. Asha's face used to put you in mind of a Delaware, while Huldah's skin was light and pretty as a new tavern sign. But Huldah's hair grew black as Asha's ever grew, and today her voice was Asha's through and through. Seeing Asha in her mind like that must have fetched out all the trouble that lay within her, and brought it to a point, for Asha had done her wrong like Porteous had, and now Huldah was acting mighty like her. She'd rather for a little if she didn't look at Huldah. She turned her back and went to the fire, poking it hard. Never did she notice all the sparks and smoke that kept coming out in the cabin, till she turned to see her oldest ones close around her. They had pushed back from the table, for never had they seen their ma'am like this before. She looked like the puncheons were coming up to meet her, and like the cabin logs slunk in the walls like snakes. "Come on, sit down, ma'am," Gordon argued with her. He took one side and Kinsey the other. They tried to get her to the table, but she was a horse you couldn't lead to water, and neither could you make her drink. She just shook them off and stood there holding on to her chair. So this, she told herself, was how folks felt when they said they had narve strings, a-twitching them this way and that. Why, up to now, never did she even know she had a narve string in her body. Oh, she had gone through plenty in her time. She had buried her mother and oldest girl. Her pap had run off. Her sister lost her mind for a while, and more than once she never knew where her next mouthful was coming from. But always could she hold up her head, even after Asha ran off with Jenny's Louie. Now she and her young ones had been shamed to the settlement, and it would get no better when Porteous and Mistress Bartram's babe was born. Long as it lived, folks would put their hands to their mouths when they saw it, and tell strangers and youth what they knew. How could she have been so blind not to see this a-coming? And what ailed her now that she felt so weak and down? She couldn't believe a person could get this way just from shame. Oh, Jerry used to tell of a woman in the old state who had grieved herself to the grave because her man got mad and jumped out of his and her bed and in bed with her sister. But she wasn't grieving, Sayward told herself. She always told Porteous he could pick up and go whenever he wanted, and the first year they were married, she wondered that he didn't leave an ignorant woodsy like her, That's what he should have done first, and this other afterward. Now he had done them both wrong. He needn't have thought of his lawful wife if he didn't want to, but he might have recollected he had 7 children he had come by honestly. "Don't you want to lay down, ma'am?" Sayward heard them asking her now. Through the door that Libby had opened for air, she could see her oxen feeding idly by the barn. "No, they's corn to plow. It's too wet." "Not now. The ground's a-dryin' off fast." "Gordon can do it then," they told her. "Sure I can," Gordon promised. "No, they won't have nothin' to do with you," she said, meaning the oxen. "I don't see why your pappy had to take resolve off today." Her children reckoned she was mighty foolish, wanting to go out and plow when she had no dinner, and when hardly could she stand without the chair to hold on to. But she'd have plow handles to hold on to out there, she told them. Her mind was set, and she paid no attention to what they said. She had taken off her handkerchief, good dress, and shoes before cooking at the fire. Now she took off her cabin dress, and put on her field gown. Kinsey went out as soon as he finished eating. Through the door she could see him trying to yoke up the oxen for her. Hardly could he lift the yoke to their necks, for it was a solid cherry piece, and weighed like stone. The oxen wouldn't do his bidding. They knew who they had to mind and who they hadn't. You couldn't check-rein them like a horse, and now they kept cropping the grass where they pleased, for Sayward didn't believe in muzzling them with splint-nose baskets. When she got there, Kinsey's face was red from hollering at the beasts, and struggling with the yoke. He gave a quick look up into his ma'am's face as she took it from him. It was longer than a common yoke, so the team could have room to work on the side hill if they had to. Will Beagle had promised to steam and bend a lighter and smaller yoke of black walnut, so the younger ones could handle it, but he was kept too busy in his boatyard and shop. She set the yoke on Buck's neck and held the other end up. "Come under Bright," she called, and after a little the off-ox lumbered around, and under meek as a hound. Oh, they knew her voice when they heard it, and resolves too. He could say, "Give me a bus, Buck," and the nigh one would run his rough tongue along the boy's cheek. Now Sayward fastened the second bow, and locked the chain to the coupling ring. With the chain dragging, she walked them out in the field, and fastened the chain to the plow. It felt good to get her hands on the handles. They were something she could hold to. "Come on, get up," she called out. They stood stolid and stock still like they always did, for they weren't quick like horses. It took time for a command to get through their heavy skulls. You could see it got through Buck's first. He turned his head, and when Bright wasn't ready to move as yet, he poked him with the end of his horn. Then both lowered their heads a lick, taking their time, letting the yoke slip into the hump on their necks, sighing and moaning softly, for she had left the plow board set deep in the ground. All the time they were leaning gradual to the pull. You couldn't rush them, get them mad, and they shook their heads and yawed around. At such a time they would turn the yoke and foul it if you gave them a chance. You had to be even-tempered, and patient with them if you wanted to work with oxen. The plow was moving now, slow and steady, like a keel boat sailing a groundy sea. Sayward told herself she had one thing to be glad for. She didn't know what she'd do if it was the Sabbath, and she had to sit in the house today with humans for company. Oxen didn't stare at you, and you didn't have to answer their questions. She knew Buck and Bright nigh as well as her own children. She was bound she'd make a team of these two from the time they were bull calves. She cut the meanness out of them her own self at 3 or 4 months, made a little rough yoke for Resolve to train them, and set him to pulling light poles with a log chain. Now they were red monster beasts, almost as knowing as humans. They'd ask for their breakfast quick as her young ones in the mornings if she was late. You could hear them from the barn, getting louder and louder, telling you that you better hurry up, rattling the manger with their horns if you didn't come. Many a time, when they were loose, they would come up to the house in winter for turnip parings, or any scrap you had. If they knew you, they'd rub up against you friendly as a cat. It did her good now to call at them, letting off the black bile she felt for Porteous. The team didn't mind. The plow wouldn't turn its long dark ribbon any faster around the stumps. Bawl at them all she liked, the team would move sluggishly. First, one step, and a kind of easy look around, then another step, and a look at the country. Not that they halted in between. All was one slow steady pull. They never let up for sprout or stone, and if she didn't throw the plow over for a stump root in their road, one or the other would have to give, for the team wouldn't. You could get mad at them, but they would cure you. It had something restful in the placid way they went, nodding their heads or chewing their cud. Once you saw them pursue their deliberate and melancholy journey around the field, your nerve strings could not help but let up a little. In the woods, the branch of a tree could fall on them. They might puff, but never would they stir from their tracks. They would go through a tight place like bars or stumps, better than horses. Seldom shying in fear, the gate post would jump at them. Buck, she'd bawl out. Bright, every second team of steers in the country she reckoned, was named Buck and Bright. They didn't mind being hollered at. It was their tolerance and patience with their strength that calmed you. Their steady gait and motion talked to you plain as words. They would save themselves. They were sure to get there till the time came. No use to buck and fret. World wasn't made in a day. What was split. Crying over it wouldn't make it clean and put it back into the kettle. Not till evening did she give up following in the good-smelling furrow, and then she hated to part with her team for the night, but they were glad enough to quit, for they had each other's company. Hardly could she keep up to them, making for the barn. She let them in their double stall, where they stayed with only a rope around their horns, to the manger. They were mighty attached to each other. They ate together, slept together, and worked together. They even drank together, standing side by side in the run. If you had to separate them, the one in the barn kept up bawling till the other was back again. Sayward's girls stood gravely staring at her when she came in to make their supper. They could see now that their mam felt better. The boys could likely tell too, though the only way they showed it was by going up to bed soon as they could after supper. Perhaps they didn't want to be down here when their father came. But Porteus wouldn't show up tonight, she knew. Not for several nights anyway. He would have business at Tateville and even go to the county seat if it suited his purpose. Tonight, when her side of the house was quiet, she went to the other side. The spring wind nearly blew out her candle on the dog trot, but here in Porteus's room it burned straight and still. There was his writing table, his iron inkwell, and his pack of uncut quills. His books were in the cupboard, and his clothes hanging on wall pegs. Yonder stood his cherry bed. It was really his and hers, but she found out today she had shrieked on it. She had made him sleep over here by himself. That was her secret sin. All the time she reckoned she had known it. You couldn't cheat God and live. Sooner or later his word would catch up to you. Well, she reckoned Porteus could come home now if he wanted to. Oh, back in her heart she would never let him off, but she wouldn't show it much outside. He didn't need to worry that she'd tear into him. She was broke to the yoke now. She had fought against it. She had yawed around and fouled it. But it did no good in the end. It only got her under the whip and the harrow. When the inside of her wore off a little against Porteus, she reckoned she'd better move over here for the night. The girls were plenty big enough to take care of themselves, and if anybody got sick, she wouldn't be far off. Of course, never had she thought she would sleep in Porteus's off-the-floor bed, and rather she wouldn't. But you didn't go on rathers in this life. She better go along quiet as she could now in her cherry yoke and bear her load. Chapter 19 Town Site. There was one thing more that Sayward hated in this life, but she'd go through with it. That was going out the first time with her new baby after telling Jenny she was through with childbearing. From Jenny, that boast had gone through the woods. At the time folks reckoned it true. Hadn't years passed without a sign or symptom. Why, Sayward had borne 7 living and 1 dead. That was enough for one woman. But now, after all that time, this new baby had showed up, making its mam out a liar. Such a babe is always a little joke to the countryside. Folks call it the afterclap, for the clap of thunder that comes after you reckon the storm is over. So you tried to be clever and outsmart God. Such a babe says when it comes. Now you got showed up in front of everybody. Well, that's what. You get for reckoning you could get the best of the Almighty. Right now Sayward was in her and Porteus's room a-dressing. There was the cherry bed. She had slept with him for nigh onto 2 years, and here in the scarred cherry cradle was her babe. Oh, you could tell that the Lord had something to do with this newest one. It gave you the mortal saddest look out of its rain-blue eyes you ever saw in a babe, and its mouth drew down every minute like it was going to quiver. This was the nearest to Sully that Sayward ever saw in a young one, not her own pert and lively Sully, but her sister Sully lost in the woods when she was a little tyke, and never seen or heard of again. Or leastwise, that was how Sayward pictured little Sully in her mind, a wandering forlorn through the deep woods, with nothing to eat and nobody to talk to, and thinking would she ever lay eyes on her brother and sisters and home sweet home again. But Sayward wouldn't call this one Sully. No, that was a bad luck name. She called her Mercy, for it was God's mercy she came so easy, with never an hour of misery before she was born or afterward. The rest called her Massy, like folk spoke the name around her. Even Porteous said it something like that. It seemed that was the way they spoke Mercy in the Bay State. The only good thing today was that she and Porteous and the babe didn't have to go out together. Porteous had left a little while ago. Oh, all was cake and pie between him and her, but seldom did they go anywhere together. No, if both had to go to the same place, they saw they were never ready at the same time. If she got ready first, she would say, well, she reckoned she might as well be going. The little ones couldn't walk so fast anyway, and he would say, yes, you go ahead. He had some paper to write first. Now, if he was ready first, he'd put on his hat and say he thought he might walk ahead. Could she get there all right? And she'd say, yes, go ahead. She had to dress Deesia, or comb her hair, or put a kettle of meal on to simmer while she was off. Oh, everything was fine as silk between them again. You couldn't tell a lick anything had ever been wrong. Not when they were in the cabin, but when they went outside there was just this small thing between them, for the sake of looking right in front of other folks. It couldn't be more than once, Sayward asked herself, that she had almost let Porteous off, but not quite. She had her old dress off and her best one about on when Gordon came bustling in from the kitchen. "Ma'am, can I borrow your old wrapper?" he asked her. "Now what do you want with that?" she said. "Just for a minute, ma'am. Fay and Leah Morrison are in the kitchen. They came in with resolve to see you on the way to the river. Now you don't need to hurry, ma'am. They're a-settin' down to wait for you." All the time he was putting on the dove-gray dress she called her cabin wrapper. It was much too big for him, the wide and deep ways, but not up and down. He had grown up now about as far as he'd get. He'd soon be his own man, but never would he be as fleshy as his ma'am. He had to go to the pile of wool stuff by the big wheel in the corner and stuff in at his waist to make a bosom to match his ma'am's. Then he put her old blue sun-bonnet down over his head and a smirk on his face. He stared to see who he looked like. Why, never had she dreamed her second boy, with his Yankee Gimber jaw, favored her any. It could almost be herself, save for his dark eyes like Worth's. "Now, what are you up to?" she demanded, but he was off in her dress, across the dog trot, and she went after. "Don't you come yet, ma'am," he begged her. Then he opened the kitchen door and swept in. Standing there on the cold dog trot, with the door opened a mite on her fingers, she could see her old dress and bonnet flounce in the kitchen and up to those nice Morrison girls. They stood up from their stools when they saw her. Why, girls, the thing that looked like her, minced in a high voice, and the next thing they knew, it had bust first Leah and then Fay on the cheek, and then Fay again, the prettiest one, smack on the mouth. Fay drew back surprised and looked at him, and then was a great hullabaloo with Libby and the young girls jumping around crying, "It ain't ma'am, it's Gordon." Fay brushed off her mouth and cheek, and Resolve got up mad as hops, for Fay was the one he had been taking home from meeting for more than a year. Sayward reckoned she was just in time to stop a hitch between her two oldest boys and her kitchen. It was lucky she was home, for those two had been spoiling to get at each other's throats a long time, and a fight between brothers is the bitterest fight of all, especially if they are nigh onto grown men, and twice so if over a woman. "Gordon," she said sharply, "go in the other room, and take my wrapper off. Resolve, you can stay here. Stop your hootin' and howlin'. Sooth, why, Fay, I'm real glad you stopped in. And you too, Leah." Now wasn't that a Yankee trick, she said to herself, after Resolve and the two girls had left for the celebration. It made her forget for a little, but now she still had to meet what she hated to go through. Even here inside the house, she could hear the hatchets and saws. They came from Will Beagle's boat yard. They were chipping and pounding and whining at a great rate, for this was the big day when the first keel boat ever built on this river was to take to the water. Folks were coming 10 miles to see it get off, and Porteous had promised to make a speech for the occasion. Kinsey was down to the river all morning, and Huldah had gone with Amy McMahon, a red shoe-fly ribbon low on both their necks. The rest of her girls were all washed and dressed already. Now they fetched their tiny mite of a sister from the new room and pulled on its coat and cap. Sayward had had to make everything brand new for Massey. Deesia was easy on her clothes, and never wore anything out, not even after it had been handed down from Sooth, but Sayward had given all such away. Never was she going to have another babe. Deesia was to be her last. Opening the door, now she drew back a little at sight of all the folks on the trace. Oh, she knew all along the main reason why she hated going out to the celebration. It wasn't just being there in front of everybody, with her after-clap baby. No, it was that Mistress Bartram and her child would likely be there too, for this was her man's boat that was being put to the water. All the folks there who knew would be smiling to their own selves at the regular steps from Resolve down to Deesia, and how Mistress Bartram's child fitted in the telltale gap between Deesia and Massey. But that wasn't so much what fretted Sayward. It was what she would do when she saw Mistress Bartram, who seldom came from her cabin since her babe was born. Never did Sayward see an acquaintance with a new child without going up to shake hands and ask about it. But it would be mighty hard going up to Mistress Bartram and Porteous's child. Oh, Sayward hated like poison to go to the celebration today, and a good deal would she give to get out of it if she could. But if she saw that woman with Porteous's child, she knew no other way than go up and ask kindly of them, and let Porteous squirm and other folks standing around nudge each other and whisper together if they wanted to. "I'll tote her now, ma'am, if I don't have to later," Libby said, boosting up Massie in her arms. Then they went out. It was late winter time, and the snow lay in white patches on the black ground. It lay deeper in the woods, but it had no woods to the river. Hardly a tree was left standing that way any more, only roofs and chimneys along the bank. The first you saw was George Roebuck's brick front establishment, and then Sam Slopper's tavern, and Ferry House alongside. Upstream from there stood the cabins and sheds of Jake Tench and his boatmen, and south of the tavern a ways was the 2-story log house Zephon Brown built as a speculation. Ezra Griswold, the miller, lived in it. If floods hadn't twice carried out his dam on the river, the boatmen would have knocked out the breast anyway, and now he was having a race dug all the way from Crazy Creek, and building his mill down here soon as spring came. Below his house stood Will Beagle's shop and cabin, and next several cabins where his hands lived. Here the river swept inward, and on the shelf of this bank, between the turn and the sawmill, Will had leased the land from Sayward to put up his boat yard. Sayward and her little girls crossed the run to the meeting house, and took the lane that ran to the ferry. In front of George Roebuck's and the ferry house, another lane ran up and down the river, and this they turned into for the boat yard. But they couldn't get there as soon as the girls wanted. Every little ways somebody would stop Sayward to see the new baby, or ask how much she wanted for a quarter-acre here along the river, or yonder by the meeting house. "Ma'am, come on, ma'am," Sayward's girls would say, pulling at her. They had been down plenty times to see those boats a-building, and they couldn't wait to see them again today. No telling how long Sayward would have left herself, stand a-talking to folks, and putting off getting there if a horn hadn't blown up the river. Oh, that was the liveliest sound in these woods, the music of a boat horn on the water. It was the first they heard all winter, for the river was still running with ice. It must be Jake Tench's old keel boat, she reckoned, coming down from Tateville, where it was stove in and froze up since before Christmas. She could see it now, a-rounding the bend, with what looked like Jake himself standing on the cargo roof, steering with one hand and blowing his horn with the other. It looked for a minute like he was going by, then he turned it sharp to shore, where several hands jumped out in the water with the cordel and pulled it to the bank. Later, Will Beagle would haul it up on trusses and patch it up. He would putty the cracks inside and pitch the seams outside with a caulking mallet. It wasn't long now till Jake Tench's horn and Tim Feist's fiddle were up on the cargo roof of the new boat. That was the sign for festivities to start. Sayward had to make for the boat yard now, for everybody else went, and her girls gave her no rest, crying and dragging at her till they had her standing by the 2 new boats, one only half finished, both perched on trusses along the river bank. Fine-looking hulls they were, in their fresh hand-planed lumber, long, slender, and shallow-drafted, their sides and ends fashioned smooth and shapely as a mitten. A short mast stood above. The only heavy thing about them was the great 4x4 keel to protect them from submerged logs and a rocky bottom, and that's where they got their name. Somebody called to them. It was Gordon and Kinsey up on the boat, ready for the water. Jenny stood up there too. When she saw them, she laughed and waved and called down and beckoned. Now that was the last thing Sayward wanted to do, climb up there where Jake's woman was sure to be, and where they'd have to stand in front of everybody. But Jenny made Will come and help lift up the girls and baby, and Sayward had no other way than crawl up too. Jenny made a picture holding Sayward's new baby. Sayward couldn't get over the change in Jenny since the news came that Louis was dead up at the English Lakes, and that Asha had another man already. Oh, Jenny tried to mourn her man, but she looked 10 years younger while she grieved him. All these years, Will Beagle had stayed sweet on her, and now that she was free to stand up to the circuit rider with him, she was like a tree frozen for many springs, so it could not flower. But now, in a warm and balmy spring, it was coming out in full bloom. A little late, and up in years, but a sight you couldn't pass by without stopping. Today, rocking Massey on her breast, and chattering to Sayward, she looked like a white magnolie. Oh, everybody all over the boat-yard was swapping talk, rawhiding his neighbors or calling to acquaintances farther off. A peddler had his wares spread out, a genuine diamond breast pin for 6 shillings. He dared the young fellows. Made 50 feet under water. Give it to the girl you're afraid of, and she'll say you can stay with her before you get in the house. An old woman threaded the woods folk with a basket of socks and mittens and Yankee notions, while a spry Tateville bakeman in a red stocking cap balanced a board of gingerbread squares over the heads of the crowd. It stayed noisy till Porteous climbed to the roof of the keel boat and held up his hand to the crowd. "Blow that horn," he said in a low voice to Jake Tench. Jake drew a mortal long note, and Porteous began with reciting as often was his wont. His deep voice rang with feeling on the sunny winter scene. "O boatman, wind that horn again, for never did the listening air upon its lambent bosom bear so wild, so soft, so sweet a strain." Even the Maytown peddler was quiet now as could be. It didn't take long to find out what Porteous's oration was about. He was talking on keel boats, praising them to the skies, how they blessed the upper rivers, where bigger craft could not go, traveling downstream, loaded with pork, flour, and bales of skins, first into the broad Ohio, last into the great Mississippi, to the far city of Orleans. Then back they came 1,000 miles or more with a cargo of hogsheads, of sugar, and bags of green, coffee, faggots of Swedish iron, and English blistered steel, of bales of cotton, kegs of salmon, barrels of mackerel, crates of queen's ware and crockery, tierces of oil, casks of nails, pipes of foreign wines and spirits, and boxes of Spanish cigars. Oh, it was something to hear Porteous puff Jake Tench and his boatmen, and the hard work they had to do, poling and pulling the boat upstream, dragging it by hand through fish dams, sometimes unpacking it from stem to stern, to carry every pound on their backs through a shallow ripple. He had a good word for the boat right, too, and his masters of saw and plane, never using a poor piece of plank that might be stove in by a rock or log, and lose all the boat carried into the river. Sayward didn't listen all the time. She could hear Porteous at home. Much of the while she looked the crowd over for Mistress Bartram and her child. What a strange feeling it would give her to see that child listening to its own pappy a-speaking, while its half-sisters and brothers stood a short distance away. Sayward's eyes searched every face, but not a sign of that slender body in seamstress clothes, and with a curl on her pale forehead did she find. So it must be true what folks said, she sighed, that Jake's wife was changed and shamed and would not leave her cabin, not even to see her own man's keel boat put on the river. It seemed Will Beagle hadn't a minute to himself or Jenny. He was down underneath, they said, making sure of the caulked seams, when Porteous finished his speech, and then you could hear him and his hands knocking out the trusses. Every blow of those mallets you could feel on your feet through the cargo box. The younger ones shrieked. The boat was settling down now on log rollers. It had to lie crooked on account of the keel, and all had to hold to keep from sliding off the slanted roof. Everybody on the boat was a-laughing, squealing, and scrambling now, for an army of men pushed the boat on its rollers. Bumpety-bumpety-bump it went, rocking this way and that, jolting hard as blacksmith iron over rough places. Of a sudden the front end dipped. The young ones yelled. The front end kept diving. Then it came up, shaking off the water, and now it lay level as a table, smooth as butter and quiet as a setting duck, on the soft bosom of that river. On the shore the people sent up a rough cheer. Some feared the boat would drift down with the stream, but Jake and Will had that all tended to. The long cordel was fastened to the mast, then to the front end by another rope they called the bridle, and Jake's men began to march up the bank, hunched forward with the cordel over their shoulders. They had to go mighty slow to get the boat started upstream. Then it followed like a dog after its master. The young folks on the boat looked at each other pleased. They were getting a free ride, a better one than on the ferry where it cost a penny. Sayward stood there with her babe in her arms. Now why did everybody reckon they had to swap so much talk with her? Ever since she came out of the cabin today, folks acted like they looked up to her almost more than to Will Beagle or Porteous. She didn't want to talk to anyone right now about selling more of her land for folks to build houses on. All she wanted was to see how those houses already built looked from here. That was the Griswold house, with a high back step and a sod plank outhouse. And that was the ferry house, with a double log privy. And next was the back of the warehouse. They were going to so Jake and his hands could load the new boat. Farther up was where Tim Feist lived. Next was Jake's place, and back there were Will Beagle's smith shop and boat yard, with the second boat still unfinished, its upright ribs uncovered below like a pumpkin mouth, with its teeth notched. Beyond was the new sawmill. Over the tops of these buildings she could see the roofs of the meeting house and schoolhouse off yonder, and between them her own double cabin and barn. Oh, 100 times or more had she seen these buildings from the farm side, but never had she seen them from the roof of a keel boat on the river. She couldn't get over how grand and imposing the river bank looked, with cabins and houses setting on it, and a lane like a street running along in front. Her own buildings and roofs back yonder were weathered gray, but those along the street were brighter with fresher logs and shakes. Why, she could count 9 or 10 chimneys a-sending out smoke at one time like Tateville. The street swarmed with humans a-hurrying up to see the boat moored at George Roebuck's and maybe get on and try it themselves. When the others got off, you could hear their talk, the children crying, and dogs a-barking. Every little while the bakeman's voice came over the water, "Sweet bread with Chinese spicin'." Once she thought she heard somebody say plain, "Hurror for Kentuck." It must have been the miller's parrot, for his back door stood open. Right yonder was a spot Sayward remembered. It was where she had waded in the river when she was a girl and washed herself all over with sand. She had stood there plumb naked then. She couldn't do that any more, for there would be more than a porcupine to watch her these days. "Don't you want to sit down, Sayward?" a deep voice asked her. Only one person ever called her like that, Sayward. She looked around, and there was Porteous standing by her with a boatman's stool in his hands. Even Porteous, she told herself, showed too much politeness today to suit her. She settled herself on her stool, her babe on her lap, while the others made a wide arc around so she could see out. Where Huldah was, God only knew, but her little girls hung around the stool, and her boys stood a ways behind her. Not a word did she hear now about their having to give up and die if she didn't move to Tateville. All they were set on today was this keel boat and that street of store, tavern house, and cabins along the shore. She noticed they didn't say settlement any more. They said town. Already folks were talking of pulling stumps from the street and lanes to make it safer walking after nightfall. Now who would have reckoned, Sayward asked herself, that all the time this dark, choked-up riverbank, under the big butts and tangled vines, here by the Moonshine Church, was a town site just waiting for its time in God's almanac to come around.